Hi, my name is Kendra Johnston, and I'm the Director of Disability Services. I'm going to take this opportunity to share with you a little bit of information about disability services, some of the things that we do, and some of the common misconceptions that are associated with our office. So let's get started. So I just have some basic information here. I've listed our staff. So there's myself, Alex Rogers, who's our coordinator of disability services, Miles Urban, our graduate assistant, Nikki Kelso, our South Campus Testing Center graduate assistant, Justin John, our North Campus Testing Center graduate assistant, and Annie Garofalo, who is our ADHD coach. And the ADHD coach, that is a position where that person will meet with students who have been diagnosed with ADHD. And sometimes that's on a weekly or biweekly basis. They meet with students who might need some assistance in building skills for executive functioning, prioritization, study skills, whatever the case may be. And if students are interested in ADHD coaching, they can email the disability services email and we can kind of direct them to scheduling for that. I've also listed some of our proctors for the testing center there. The location of disability services is in the Bush Student Center, Suite 331. Our testing centers are not located in the Bush Student Center. Our North Campus Testing Center is in DePere Hall, and our South Campus Testing Center is in the School of Nursing. And then I've listed our contact information down there at the bottom. So a little more basic information for you. What we do is we provide academic or housing accommodations for students who have disabilities. So for academic accommodations, we require a completed application, and that can be found on our website. We also require documentation. So that's just something that's going to share some information about the disability. And we'll accept that in the form of an IEP or 504 plan if a student has had accommodations in K through 12. We also accept evaluations or a letter from a diagnostician, just including information about the diagnosis and the functional impact of the diagnosis in terms of academics. We also require that students schedule an appointment with disability services so that we can talk through some potential accommodations. Students can schedule via EAB Navigate, which is a tab located under the tools section in their MySLU. And I'll go over the appointment piece in just a minute in a little further detail. We also provide housing accommodations. So the process for that just includes students sending an application, which is available on our website, and documentation. So the documentation for housing accommodations is going to look a little bit different than for academic accommodations. So we request a letter for housing accommodations from a treating diagnostician, and it must include information about the diagnosis and the impact to daily living and how that kind of relates to the housing accommodations request. And we also require an appointment for housing accommodations, and they can schedule that in the same way that I mentioned previously. I just wanted to mention a couple of requests that do not come through disability services. And the reason that I wanted to mention those is sometimes students will come to us with certain requests that don't apply to a disability, and then they're doing a lot of back and forth. So some of those requests include dietary requests for religious reasons or for reasons related to dietary choice, such as vegetarianism or veganism. We also do not do requests for exemption from housing contract or roommate requests. Something else I put on there is advocacy and support. We work with students on building self-advocacy when needing to talk with professors about their accommodations. We also will be there for support for students if there are any concerns that arise with a class or how to use an accommodation. We always want to remain a support. So when students come to our office for accommodations, that's not necessarily the last time that we see them. If students need additional support throughout their time at SLU, we're there for that. I also included DTALK in there. So DTALK is a student-run organization, and it was created by a student of ours a few years ago. It's basically just a group for students who are registered with disability services or who have a disability but maybe not registered with our office. And they can meet once a month to just support one another and to talk through different things that they might be going through. So sometimes that's disability related and sometimes it's not. But it is really great opportunity for newer students to SLU so that they can meet other individuals and perhaps cultivate some relationships. So I wanted to add a slide in there about COVID-19. That's pretty pertinent right now. So just to kind of reiterate, scheduling for appointments, students can do that via EAB Navigate. When they've done that, we'll send them a link to a Zoom meeting for that date and time, and then we'll meet with them via Zoom. So when we do return to campus, for extenuating circumstances, students can come into the office and meet with us, though there will be some requirements such as wearing a mask, maintaining 6 feet of distance, and that might mean that we need to meet in a conference room as opposed to an office. But in most cases, we're going to request that students meet with us via Zoom. Sending documents, that's changing a little bit as well. So historically, students had the option to bring their documents to the suite in Bush Student Center. We're now asking that students either send those via email or fax them to us. So that would be the preferred method at this point. For online learning, we do have some resources available on our website. So if you want to jump over there at some point and review those, I would highly recommend that. We do have some specific accommodations listed and some just notes about how those can be implemented in an online environment. We do recommend that if students are engaging in online learning, that they're keeping in constant contact with faculty and with our office should any concerns arise about using their accommodations online. So I wanted to go over some common misconceptions. And the reason that I wanted to do this is because oftentimes students will come to our office and say, I wish I had met with you all sooner, but I thought this or I thought that. And I just feel that sometimes these misconceptions can present a barrier for students so that they're not coming to our office and getting the resource that they might need. So here are some common misconceptions that we hear, that we only work with students who have physical disabilities, that temporary injuries don't count as a disability, that accommodations don't exist for students with mental health diagnoses, that if a student has never used accommodations in the past, they aren't eligible for accommodations at the university level, that disability services will share information with faculty, and when I say information, I mean diagnostic information, or that faculty won't allow students to use accommodations. So here's the truth, and this is where I'm going to break down some of those barriers. So we work with students who have any one of the following disabilities: mental health, physical disabilities, learning disabilities, neurodevelopmental diagnoses, temporary injuries or diagnoses, medical diagnoses, hearing or visual impairments, etc. So it's not just physical disabilities. Temporary accommodations exist for those with temporary injuries. So if a student breaks their arm or gets a concussion or has a surgery that's going to put them out for a little while and result in some absences, we can certainly work with that student to implement some temporary accommodations so that they're not penalized for those things that they may not be able to control as a result of that injury. And they'll follow the same process that any student would follow to register with us. Students can most certainly receive accommodations for mental health diagnoses. So if a student has a mental health diagnosis and they feel that they might need accommodations, they can follow that registration process to work through some potential accommodations. If a student has never had accommodations before, but has a diagnosis or feels that there might be an existing diagnosis, they are encouraged to meet with our office. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But what I mean here is, sometimes we have students who come to our office and they say, hey, I think I might have a diagnosis. I'm experiencing these symptoms, but I don't know. Then we'll refer students to specific resources. And then, if it's found that down the line they, in fact, do have a diagnosis, we can provide accommodations for that. Diagnostic information shared with disability services is confidential, and only the student has the authority to share their diagnostic information. So some students come to us and say, I thought that there would be a lot of stigma because people would find out. We do not share any diagnostic information with faculty or anyone else at the university. any of the information that's provided to us, whether that be documentation, application, or anything that a student says to us regarding their diagnostic information, that is just to remain within disability services. If a student chooses to disclose their diagnostic information, that is entirely up to them, but that is not something that our office will do. As long as an accommodation is reasonable, faculty should allow students to use accommodations. So that term reasonable, I want to talk about that for a second. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, is what informs our work when it comes to accommodating students. So we refer to that for guidance. They use that term reasonable, and essentially what that means is if an accommodation is not going to fundamentally alter the course, then it is reasonable. So I'll give you an example. If a student is taking a public speaking course, and because of a disability, they can't or do not want to engage in any public speaking, while there might be some alternatives, so for example, instead of speaking in front of the class, perhaps they can submit a video of themselves speaking to their professor. There is going to be some component of public speaking in the assignments, because to implement an accommodation that would prevent that would not be reasonable in that type of course. So that's just an example. In most cases, an accommodation will be reasonable. And in most cases, faculty are very accommodating. But if that ever occurs where there's some pushback, then students can contact our office and we can kind of work through that. But again, that's not often the case. So I mentioned in the last slide that I was going to go over this in a little more detail. So if a student has never had accommodations, or if they think that they might have a diagnosis but they're not sure, this is going to be the slide that you'll want to pay attention to. So again, just required information for our office to implement accommodations, documentation, and application. So if a student comes to our office and they say, hey, I have never had an accommodation, but I do have a diagnosis, we're just going to request the documentation and we can go through that process as we would in any other case. If a student comes to us and says, I don't have a diagnosis, but I think I might, that's when we're going to provide some resources. So we never want to make assumptions about whether or not a student has a diagnosis or what that diagnosis might be. So what we do is we refer students to those professionals. So we might say you could go talk with your treating physician or whatever provider you see, or you can go to an external testing facility that would test for, perhaps ADHD or learning disability or something to that effect. Another resource that we refer students to is the Psychological Services Center. So the Psychological Services Center is located in Morrissey Hall on campus, and they conduct testing for things like ADHD or learning disability through different instruments. If that's something that you think you might be interested in, I would encourage viewing that page, and that can be the Psychological Services Center webpage can be accessed through the SLU search portal. On their website, they have information about scheduling and costs associated and those sort of things. It's a really helpful resource if students think they have a diagnosis, but they're not sure. If a student goes to the Psychological Services Center or some other testing site, or they see their physician and a diagnosis is established, then they can bring that documentation to our office and we will continue to discuss with them accommodations. Meeting with disability services. So students can meet with us before or after documentation is obtained. We cannot provide accommodations if they do not have documentation. But again, we can provide some resources so students can meet with us even if they don't have the documentation. And I just put, what we'll discuss there because sometimes we get those questions. In a typical meeting, often the conversation is guided by what the student says, but generally what we want to know is how is the student impacted by the diagnosis, or how do they feel they're being impacted even if they don't have a diagnosis yet, but they might be experiencing symptoms. what is that doing? How is that, what's the relationship there between the symptoms and academics? And then that helps us to determine accommodations. So that's it. If you have any questions, please feel free to email either the Disability Services email or me directly. I'm happy to answer anything. And then, happy to meet with students if there's any questions regarding any of the stuff that I talked about, or if that elicits more questions that I haven't covered. So thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your presentations.